Hi, so I don't have a PowerPoint or anything. Hannah just asked me to give some kind of personal reflections on my job and my experience working with academics as public policy manager. So basically, my job looks after the Bartlett faculty, which is the faculty of the built environment. We have 12 departments. My job is to help facilitate policy engagement across all the departments, and I work with a public policy board that sits at our faculty level. I'm not really going to go through UCL structure too much because I know there's a lot of non-UCL people here. But that's how we try and encourage academics to do policy engagement, and I work with the board to kind of assess needs and experiences. So building capacity in terms of training, looking at case studies. One of the things that I found academics ask for a lot is case studies, so they can actually see what's happening within their area. So heritage is one of the areas I work with, but not largely. It's kind of more planning, architecture, energy. And academics actually want to see examples of good policy engagement that's come before. So one of the things I do is put together case studies of particular academics, for example, who are very policy engaged, or particular projects that have been really successful. So one of the projects within our faculty that's been successful is actually, one of the things we haven't talked about actually is how to embed policy engagement within teaching. A lot of policy tends to be very research focused, but actually you can do really good things with teaching. So one of our departments works really closely with Westminster Council. They send their students out to do their master's dissertations there. The council or third party providers give them data to work on policy problems, and then the recommendations from those dissertations actually feed into council policy. And they were nominated for a Local Government Chronicle Award for that work because the dissertations were actually having a tangible effect on the policy that was coming out afterwards. So yeah, basically, I'm just going to talk a little bit about actually what happens on the ground. You know, like, I work in a faculty that's really policy active. And so I'm going to talk about how our academics feel about policy and their policy engagement, because I spend a lot of time talking to them about challenges and how they strategize it. I think a lot of the session so far we've talked about how to strategize policy engagement. But actually when you talk to academics who are doing policy engagement, they have a slightly different perspective on it. So I kind of titled it Strategic or Incidental, mainly because incidental is one of these words that I keep coming up against. When I say, how are you engaging in policy, everyone says, oh, it's really incidental, it's really not targeted, I don't really plan for this, it just comes along, I just get asked to do stuff, I don't really think about how to do this strategically. And often I come up against that because I'm asking them to be strategic. So I'm trying to look at how each department approaches policy. And whether they're doing that in specific ways. So we can look at particular departments who are doing very well in teaching, for example, or who are doing really, really well in commissioned research, so we can actually learn from each other. And that's one of the point of my post. But I think for them being asked to think about how they strategize policy is actually quite unfamiliar. And one of the things I've learned is academics who've been doing policy for quite a while and policy engagement are actually really rubbish about talking about how they're approaching it, because they're so embedded in it and they've got those relationships so established that they can't see how they got to that position in the first place. So they can't necessarily share with early career researchers, for example, how they're in that position in the first place. So yeah, people would say incidental or not targeted. I was talking to one colleague who's doing a big independent commission that was actually talking on my table about regional inequality in the UK. And he got some teaching buyout to be involved in that project because it was going to take a lot of his time. And I said, well, how do your department actually strategize for where the funding is going to be available? And he just said, well, we don't really. There might be a project one year, there might be nothing the next year. And he said, I've never really worked out how you strategize this stuff. So I think that's just saying that there's a big element of flexibility actually when you're getting into stuff and how to talk to departments about it. And there's definitely kind of not a sense of it being led at a department level, just despite the fact that certain departments have particular approaches. A lot of people said, well, it's up to me, I have to make my own impact, it's on a really personal level, I have to do all the work for it. And I think actually when you step back and see it, that's not necessarily the case. You can definitely group together. So for instance, if you were responding to a select committee inquiry, it might make sense if you're a group of researchers working all on the same topic to group together and to make a joint input into that inquiry that will then get published as written evidence. So I think sometimes the idea that it's all incidental and really personal, you can overlook where collaboration might be more useful. Other people have called it quite entrepreneurial and driven by individuals. I think that's something we've covered today. Policy is like super relationship based, like it's all about building networks. And one senior research associate said that all the policy engagement was basically driven by two senior academics within his department. I would also say that those two senior academics were obviously white and male, which is a shame, but it's just what's happening, and part of my job is to get more diverse voices involved in policy engagement. But that the senior academics would basically drive research associates into projects and say, go out to Bays, go out to this department, go out and talk to people. So it's really driven by who is leading your department and their kind of commitment to it. Because our departments work on issues like energy, obviously that's very relevant to government departments like Bays, so they've kind of got the ear of them already. But it's also because those senior academics have the connections, so you can go to them and say, I'm doing research on this, who do I go and talk to? And they can give that recommendation already. And actually, UCL has a public policy strategy that is in part based upon that. It's based upon enabling expert-to-expert relationships. So there's an understanding from our central policy team that this network thing is really important, but they will help facilitate that as well. So it might be worth exploring in your circumstances whether that exists at your universities. But that's also a massive challenge, I think, in policy as well. Like, relationships take so much time and effort to build, and UCL really likes a mapping exercise where we basically find, yes, there's laughter because it's true, we like to find out what's going on and who's in contact with who. But with policy, it doesn't really make sense to have some kind of central relationship management system for who's talking to who, because people do move on in government roles and then someone will replace them, so it's not going to be up to date. But also, there's a sense that some of those relationships are just based on friendships and things you have in common with people. And there's another example of a colleague was trying to find someone from a local authority in London to have a 1-hour interview, and she couldn't do it. She couldn't find someone to get in contact with, and eventually talked to a colleague, and the colleague said, oh, I have this contact. So I guess in terms of whether you're strategic or incidental, I would say, from my experience on the ground and people who do policy engagement, it's really good to be strategic about who your networks are, and that you can start to build like a more policy-oriented network, so that then when they have relevant things to you, they know you're the kind of person to come to in that area. I think also one of the problems is that you build these relationships, but also you don't really know what you're going to get out of it. It would be really good to go in with like a strategy, and I do think theory of change, kind of what you want to get out of the end of it, is really useful. But a lot of the times when I've spoken to academics, they have no idea what they're going to get, because what they're starting with is a research question rather than a policy question. So they don't know where that research is going to lead them in terms of policy and policy change afterwards. Another problem I've found in actually being strategic within our departments is that sometimes your research is not actually ideologically in tune with what's going on in policy at the moment. Our planning school have quite a strong ideological cohesion in that they actually believe in planning. And then when an MP comes out and says, I don't believe in planning, I want to scrap planning regulations, they can't get their policy, or they can't actually have an influence, because they're so at odds with what is happening politically. And then another colleague who they had a meeting with the Department for Work and Pensions, and he said, they work a lot on debt reduction, and they said, it was like what we were suggesting was so unthinkable, we couldn't even start to have that relationship because the research was so at odds with what was actually happening in that department. So that is one of the challenges of, I guess, being a bit more strategic with it. But then at the same time, then they said they went to talk to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and then got them involved on a different project. So you never really know what's going to happen whenever you're going to talk to. So basically, this is really flexible. There's not great ways to be strategic on the ground, at least academics articulate it in that way. But then at the same time, a lot of people tell me there is a desire to be more strategic with what they're doing and spend some time thinking about it. So I guess one of these times is having training events like this and actually spending some time mapping out what you want to do, using your actual case studies, thinking about what you want, what kind of change you want to affect and what touch points you're going to engage with. And we have a department within our faculty who are like incredibly policy engaged. There's the Institute for Public Purpose. And one of the comments is, people who works there, he'd never seen civil servants so willing to engage with that department. But even they don't have a strategy for what they're doing in terms of policy. They just kind of field all these inquiries and just respond to what they can when they can, whereas they want to actually be more strategic about it at a departmental level. And sometimes there's actually a push from universities to be a little bit more strategic as well. We have a new dean within our faculty, and he has 2 particular strategic priority areas of climate change and inequality. So that means that our academics can kind of get on board with more collective efforts to make change in policy. So it's worth thinking about if your faculty has a strategy. If it doesn't, you want to try and make it have a strategy. Yeah. I think overall, my experience on the ground is that it's really good to have this as all kind of like a model for what you want to do, but actually in the reality of the situation, you kind of have to respond to what's coming in when it's coming in, and it's actually like a really flexible process and a really iterative process. Yeah, that's all I have to say.